Sterling silver glinted in Robert's white-knuckled grip as the German CEO rose. "Mr. Sterling," Herr Richter said, his two English words laced with finality. The multi-billion-dollar merger was dying, suffocating in a silent war of miscommunication. Sarah, clearing plates, knew exactly what they were saying and what Sterling was losing. It wasn't dying in a blaze of arguments. It was suffocating in the profound, impenetrable slunts of misunderstanding. The translator had been dismissed an hour ago, and now desperation was the only thing on the menu. And nobody, absolutely nobody, knew what to do next. The Gilded Compass was a restaurant designed to muffle the outside world. Its plush carpets absorbed sound, its heavy velvet curtains swallowed at the city's glare, and its staff moved with the silent, practiced grace of ghosts. Tonight, however, the silence in the oak room was not one of comfort, but of conflict. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from frustration and the stark, unbridgeable chasm of language. Sarah Jenkins felt it from the moment she pushed through the service door. A heavy silver tray balanced expertly on one hand. She wasn't supposed to be serving this room. This was for senior staff only, but Chloe had called in sick, and the Sterling party was a high priority, high-stress booking that required all hands on deck. Sarah, with her quiet efficiency and knack for being invisible, was deemed the safest replacement. From across the room she saw him, Robert Sterling. She'd seen his face on the cover of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. In pictures, he looked visionary, a titan of industry. In person, sitting stiffly in his tailored suit. He looked like a man being held hostage. His jaw was a knot of tension, his knuckles white, where he gripped a sterling silver fork, not to eat, but as an anchor in a storm of his own making. Flanking him were his top executives, Amelia Hayes, the COO, her face a mask of polite concern, and a younger, ambitious-looking man named David Chen, who kept fiddling with his phone under the table, a nervous energy radiating from him. Opposite them sat the Germans. Herr Klaus Rieche, the patriarch of the engineering giant, was a man in his late 60s with piercing blue eyes and a posture that suggested a lifetime of discipline. His silence was the most profound in the room. It wasn't empty. It was filled with judgment. His two associates, a man and a woman, in their 40s, mirrored his stoicism, their untouched plates of seared scallops, a testament to the failed diplomacy. Sarah knew the story. She'd heard the whispers among the staff. This was the third and final dinner. The deal to merge Sterling Dynamics with RTR's legendary German firm was on life support. The official translator, a highly paid consultant named Mr. Peterson, had, in the words of the maître, suffered a catastrophic failure of vocabulary and nerve. An hour ago, Sterling had dismissed him with a quiet but venomous command, leaving the two most powerful men in the room to communicate through strained smiles in the universally understood language of disappointment. Sarah's job was simple: clear the appetizer plates, refill water glasses, and disappear. As she moved around the table, she couldn't help but overhear the broken, desperate attempts at communication. "The, synergy," Sterling said, speaking slowly and loudly, as if the Germans were hard of hearing, not simply non-English speaking. He held up two fingers and then brought them together. "You and me together." "Good." Hera watched the pathetic pantomime with a glacial expression before murmuring something to his colleague in low guttural German. The colleague responded, his tone sharp and dismissive. Sarah froze for a microsecond, her hand hovering over a water glass. She understood every word. "He thinks we are children," Richter had said. "He brings his fingers together like a toddler playing with toys." The colleague had replied, "It is an insult to our intelligence. He believes a deal of this magnitude can be sealed with hand gestures." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. It had been years since she'd been immersed in the language, but it was a part of her soul she could never erase. Her entire academic life, her planned future, had been built around the intricate beauty of the German language and its philosophy, a future that had been snatched away, leaving her here, clearing plates for men who were butchering the very thing she had loved. She continued her circuit of the table, her movements automatic. Her mind, however, was racing. She remembered her dissertation left unfinished on a hard drive in her tiny apartment. Heidegger's progeny, The linguistic nuances of trust in modern German industrialism. It sounded so grand, so ridiculously academic. Now she'd spent 5 years at the University of Chicago, a full scholarship PhD candidate, the star of the Germanic Studies department. Then in the space of 3 months, a car accident had stolen her parents, leaving her as the sole guardian for her 17-year-old sister, Molly, and a mountain of unforeseen debt. The doctor at the professorship, the life of the mind. It all vanished, replaced by the immediate crushing need to pay rent and buy groceries. So she'd taken the first job she could get that had flexible hours and paid in cash tips. Waitressing. David Chen, the junior executive, suddenly leaned forward, holding his phone. "I have a translation app, Mr. Sterling," he offered, his voice a little too loud. "I have some university German. I can try to bridge the gap." Sterling looked at him with the desperation of a drowning man looking at a piece of driftwood. "Do it, David. Anything is better than this." David cleared his throat and spoke to Richter, his accent thick and clumsy, his grammar a mess. He was trying to convey a point about third-order profit projections, but what came out was a jumbled, almost nonsensical string of words. Sarah winced internally. He wasn't just wrong. He was being inadvertently offensive. He was using the informal euphemism reserved for friends, children, and animals when addressing the deeply traditional hair. It was the linguistic equivalent of slapping the old man on the back and calling him buddy. Richter's eyes narrowed. He said nothing, but a muscle in his cheek twitched. He picked up his linen napkin, folded it precisely, and placed it on the table. It was a gesture of finality, a signal that the evening and the deal was over. Amelia Hayes, the COO, saw it too. A flicker of panic crossed her face. "Robert," she murmured, a warning in her tone. Sterling's composure finally cracked. He slammed his palm flat on the table, not loudly, but with a sharp percussive impact that made everyone flinch. The silverware rattled. "This is a catastrophe." He hissed, his voice low and trembling with rage. "Billions of dollars, years of work gone. All because nobody in this room can speak a simple sentence of German." The silence that followed was absolute. The weight of it was immense, pressing down on every person in the room. Sarah stood by the service station tray in hand, trapped in the crossfire of a corporate war. She saw the deal slipping away. She saw the frustration on the American faces and the cold, resolute dismissal on the German faces. But more than that, she heard the silent screams of miscommunication, of cultural ignorance. And in that moment, a reckless, terrifying thought sparked in her mind. A thought that could get her fired, humiliated, and thrown out onto the street. Or just maybe it could change everything. The air in the Oak Room grew thick with the metallic taste of failure. Robert Sterling's outburst had shattered the fragile veneer of corporate civility, leaving behind the raw, ugly truth of their impasse. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed, his eyes darting between the impassive Germans and his own crestfallen team. He looked like a general whose army had been defeated without a single shot being fired. Hera pushed his chair back slightly, the legs scraping a faint, mournful sound against the polished floor. It was the unmistakable sound of departure. His associates began gathering their briefcases, their movements crisp and efficient. The end was here. "Wait." Amelia Hayes pleaded, her voice calm but strained. She leaned across the table, trying to catch Artur's eye. "Her Richa, please. There is simply a barrier, a misunderstanding. The fundamentals of this deal are strong." Rita looked at her, and for the first time a flicker of emotion crossed his face. "Pity." He responded in German, his voice even, and measured, directed at his colleagues, but meant for the entire room to feel, if not understand. Sarah, standing by the wall, felt the words like a physical blow. The fundamentals are irrelevant if the foundation is built on disrespect. RTOR stated, "They do not have the courtesy to understand us, so how can they claim to value our partnership?" David Chen, emboldened by a foolish sense of duty, once again raised his phone. "Sir, I can translate that. He's saying he is concerned about the respect of the foundation." It was a clumsy, literal, and utterly useless translation that missed the entire soul of the sentiment. Sterling's face contorted in frustration. What does that even mean? The foundation, Are we talking about the building? The financial foundation? What? I think he means the basis of the deal, David stammered, sweating now. The respect for the groundwork, it was getting worse. Chen's fumbling attempts were like throwing gasoline on a dying fire. He was reducing R2R's profound statement about mutual respect and cultural understanding into corporate jargon. Sarah watched this train wreck in slow motion. Her mind was a whirlwind. This wasn't just about language. This was about culture. The Americans saw this as a transaction, a simple matter of numbers and assets. For Rich, a man who had inherited a company his grandfather had founded, it was about legacy honor and Vuitton trust, a deep, almost sacred concept of trust that could never be conveyed by a smartphone app or a terrified junior executive with 2 semesters of college German. She felt a strange sense of ownership over the situation, an academic's indignation at seeing her field of study so carelessly brutalized. These were not just words. They were vessels of meaning, history, and worldview. Chen was smashing the vessels and showing Sterling the broken shards, pretending it was the whole picture. Her own life had been about the weight of words, the carefully chosen words of comfort she gave her sister Molly after their parents' funeral. The stark, unforgiving words on the eviction notice, the humiliating words of the academic dean, explaining why her scholarship and stipend were being terminated without a leave of absence. The program is highly competitive, Sarah. We can't simply hold a spot for you indefinitely. Words had destroyed her world. Maybe, just maybe, they could also rebuild it. RTOR was now standing. His associates followed suit. He gave a short, formal bow, a gesture of finality that needed no translation. Mr. Sterling, he said, the 2 English words sounding alien and final in his mouth. Sterling stood up, his face ashen. He had lost years of planning, of aggressive acquisitions and ruthless strategy, all culminating in this humiliating defeat in a hushed dining room. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? Shout louder, make bigger hand gestures. This was the abyss, the absolute edge of failure. Sarah's feet felt rooted to the floor. Her training screamed at her to remain invisible, to let the titans clash and fall without getting in their way. Being a waitress was about anticipating needs. Yes, but it was also about self-preservation. Getting involved was professional suicide. They wouldn't thank her. They would resent her for witnessing their failure, for overstepping her station. She would be fired on the spot. And Molly was counting on her paycheck to help pay for her community college application fees. But then, as RTO began to turn, one of his associates muttered a final biting comment to his colleague. It was a low conspiratorial whisper not meant for anyone else to hear. It is, as I predicted, American arrogance. They believe the world must learn their language, their customs. They have no depth. That was it. That was the final push. It wasn't about the deal anymore. It was about pride. Not Robert Sterling's pride, but a deeper, more fundamental pride in understanding, in bridging the gap that everyone else saw as a chasm. It was the pride of the scholar she used to be. Before her conscious mind could stop her, before the fear could paralyze her limbs, Sarah took a single step forward from the shadows of the service station. Her voice, when it came out, was quiet. Yet it cut through the ferial silence of the room with the sharpness of glass. She didn't speak to Sterling. She didn't speak to his team. She looked directly at Herr Klaus Raya, who had his back half turned towards her, and in flawless, formal academic German, she said the room went utterly still. The world seemed to stop for a full 5 seconds. The only sound was the faint hum of the restaurant's ventilation system. Sarah's words, clear and perfectly enunciated, hung in the air like a ringing bell. Excuse the interruption, Herr Rare, but what your colleague just said is not entirely fair. Klaus Rich froze mid-turn. His entire body went rigid. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head, then his entire body, to face the source of the voice. His eyes, which had been dismissive and cold, were now wide with utter astonishment. He stared at Sarah, this young woman in a simple black waitress uniform, as if she had just sprouted wings. His 2 associates looked equally stunned, their mouths slightly agape. The American side of the table was a picture of pure confusion. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. They understood the sudden dramatic shift in the room's atmosphere. They saw the Germans' shock, and it was a more powerful communication than anything that had been said all night. Robert Sterling's face went through a rapid series of emotions, bewilderment, then irritation, and finally a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. Who was this girl? A waitress? How dare she speak? How dare she interrupt this corporate funeral? He thought for a delirious moment that she was perhaps offering them more bread. What is going on? He demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. Who said that you? He pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. What did you say? Sarah's heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The adrenaline was a roaring fire in her ears. The sheer audacity of what she had just done washed over her, and for a terrifying second she felt her knees weaken. She had spoken. She had crossed a line that wasn't just professional but societal. She, the invisible servant, had given voice in a room of kings. But she didn't look at Sterling. Her focus remained entirely on her Richa. She held his gaze, her expression respectful but firm. The scholar in her had taken over the part of her that knew this was a debate, a thesis defense, not a scolding. RTOR took a step towards her, his eyes scanning her face, searching for some explanation for this impossible reality. He replied in German, his voice no longer flat, but filled with cautious curiosity. You speak German. It was less a question and more a statement of disbelief. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, maintaining the formal address. I studied it. Your language, your philosophy, your literature, they were to be my life's work. The choice of words was deliberate. My life's work. It conveyed a depth of knowledge and passion that went far beyond a simple language course. It was a signal to him that she wasn't just a translator. She was an initiate into his culture. On the American side, the confusion was boiling over into anger. David, what are they saying? Sterling snapped, turning on his junior executive. David Chen looked pale and utterly lost. I don't know, sir. She's speaking very quickly. It's a complex dialect. I think it wasn't a dialect. It was just pure articulate High German, and David's inability to even grasp it exposed his earlier claims as the charade they were. Amelia Hayes, however, was watching the interaction with a shrewd, calculating look in her eyes. She wasn't looking at Sarah as a waitress. She was looking at her as an unexpected asset, a wild card. Shut up, David, Sterling seethed, his eyes locked on Sarah. You, waitress, what is your name? Sarah Jenkins. Sir, she said, her voice steady, though her hands hidden behind her back were trembling. Miss Jenkins, Sterling said, his voice dripping with sarcasm and menace. You are fired. Get your things and get out of my sight. You have no idea the damage you have just caused. He turned back to the Germans, intending to offer a final, desperate apology for the interruption from his staff. But her Richa wasn't looking at him. He was still looking at Sarah. He held up a hand, a clear gesture for Sterling to stop. He addressed Sarah again in German. You said what my colleague said was unfair. Explain yourself. What did you find unfair? This was it, the moment of truth. She could either apologize, scurry away, and accept her fate, or she could double down on the most insane gamble of her life. She took a deep breath. Your colleague. She began her German flowing with an academic precision she hadn't used in years, spoke of American arrogance. He suggested that your hosts believe the world must conform to their ways, that they lack depth. While I understand his frustration, which stems from a profound communication breakdown, to label it arrogance is to mistake the symptom for the disease. She paused, letting the words sink in. Arter's expression was now one of intense concentration. He was no longer looking at a waitress. He was listening to an argument. The issue here is not arrogance, Sarah continued, gaining confidence with every sentence. It is a difference in cultural perspective regarding the very nature of a business agreement. Mr. Sterling and his team see this deal through a lens of metrics, efficiency, and shareholder value. It is a transactional worldview. You hear Richa and your company, which has been in your family for over a century, see it through a lens of legacy craftsmanship and a trust that is meant to span generations. He is speaking prose. You are speaking poetry, and you have no interpreter. As she finished, the room was so quiet she could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. She had laid it all bare. She had diagnosed the core problem that millions of dollars in consulting fees had failed to identify. She had done it in a language nobody on the American side understood, defending the very man who was about to fire her to the man he had been trying to win over. Robert Sterling stood there utterly powerless, his face a mask of rage and confusion. He knew something profound was happening, but he was locked on the outside, a deaf man at an opera. Harris stared at Sarah for a long, unblinking moment. Then he turned to Robert Sterling, and for the first time that night, he spoke to him in slow, heavily accented, but perfectly clear English. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice a low rumble, "I believe we will not be leaving just yet. And this young woman, Miss Jenkins, she is not fired." He gestured towards the empty translator's chair at the table. "She will sit." The command was absolute. "She will sit." For a moment, nobody moved. Robert Sterling looked as if RTOR had just slapped him across the face. He, the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, in his own private booking, had just been countermanded by a foreign national regarding his own employee. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely inverted. Amelia Hayes was the first to react. She gave Sarah a subtle but firm nod, her eyes conveying a clear message. "Do as he says. This is our only chance." Still in a state of shock, Sarah walked from the relative safety of the wall to the gleaming mahogany table. The few steps felt like a mile. She was acutely aware of the cheap rubber-soled shoes. She wore a stark contrast to the polished Italian leather of everyone else at the table. She pulled out the heavy ornate chair, the same one the disgraced Mr. Peterson had occupied hours earlier, and sat down. The starched black fabric of her uniform felt coarse and out of place against the chair's plush velvet. She folded her hands on the table, her waitress instincts fighting with the terrifying new reality of her position. "Now," RTO said, reverting to German and addressing Sarah directly. Mr. Sterling was trying to speak of synergy. "It is a word we know, but his meaning was lost. Tell me, what is his vision for this synergy? Not in his clumsy words, but in a way that an engineer, a craftsman, would understand." All eyes turned to Sarah. Sterling's gaze was a mixture of suspicion and grudging desperation. He was cornered. His entire empire, his legacy, was now inexplicably in the hands of a waitress whose name he hadn't known 10 minutes ago. Sarah turned to him. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Mr. Sterling, Herr Richa asks you to explain your vision for the synergy between the two companies. He asks that you explain it not as a businessman, but as an engineer." Sterling blinked, momentarily thrown. He was used to speaking in terms of market caps, quarterly growth, and shareholder dividends. "As an engineer?" "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "He is a man who builds things that last. He wants to understand what you intend to build with him." The reframing of the question was a revelation. It cut through the corporate jargon and hit at the heart of the matter. Sterling was silent for a moment, the gears in his formidable brain turning. He looked at RTOR, truly looked at him for the first time, not as an obstacle, but as a peer. "Okay," he said, his tone changing. The anger was gone, replaced by a focused intensity. "Okay, tell him this." He began to speak and Sarah began to translate. But she wasn't just translating, she was transforming. When Sterling said, "We will leverage your precision manufacturing capabilities to enhance our rapid prototyping division," Sarah didn't just repeat the words in German. She paused, processed, and then conveyed the essence. "Hera," she would say, "Mr. Sterling sees your workshops not merely as a factory, but as a master's studio. He believes that the discipline and exactitude of your methods can provide the foundational strength that his company's speed and agility currently lack. He imagines it as a perfectly balanced engine, your precision as the finely milled crankshaft, his innovation as the high-octane fuel. One cannot function without the other." As she spoke, a visible change came over Laus Richa. His posture softened. He leaned forward, listening intently. He started to nod, not just in politeness, but in genuine understanding. He began to ask questions, complex technical questions about material tolerances and production scaling. Sterling, in turn, answered with a fluency and passion for his own work that had been buried under layers of executive bravado. He spoke of his company's breakthroughs in composite materials and software-driven design, and with every exchange, Sarah was the bridge. She didn't just swap nouns and verbs. She found the right cultural and technical idioms. She transformed Sterling's talk of disruptive innovation into the German concept of Vorbildung durch Technik, advancement through technology. She converted his aggressive market penetration strategies into a more palatable discussion of building a long-term sustainable market presence. She was in her element. The years of studying dusty books, of dissecting the works of Goethe and Schiller, of writing papers on the philosophical underpinnings of German industrial identity. It was all flooding back. This wasn't just a translation. It was a live performance of her abandoned dissertation. She was connecting the dots, explaining the nuances, and revealing the shared values that had been lying dormant beneath the surface of their conflict. Amelia Hayes watched, mesmerized. She saw Sarah's innate talent. It wasn't just about language. It was about emotional and cultural intelligence of the highest order. She made a mental note to pull every file the restaurant had on Sarah Jenkins. David Chen, however, was shrinking in his chair. With every fluent, elegant sentence Sarah uttered, his own incompetence was thrown into sharper relief. He had tried to make himself a hero, the man who saved the deal. Now he was less than a spectator. He was a monument to the very problem Sarah was solving. A bitter, resentful jealousy began to coil in his gut. After an hour of intense, productive conversation, a waiter, one of Sarah's former colleagues, approached the table to clear the main course plates, which had grown cold long ago. He looked at Sarah, sitting at the table with the executives, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. Sarah gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, and he retreated in confusion. Finally, RTOR raised a hand. He looked from Sterling to Sarah, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He spoke in German. "Miss Jenkins, there is a clause in the final pages of the contract. Our legal team calls it paragraph 17. I call it the legacy clause. My American counterparts have dismissed it as sentimental. They wish to strike it from the document. This has been the primary sticking point for a week. I want you to explain it to Mr. Sterling. Explain why it is not sentimental but essential." Sarah's blood ran cold. The legacy clause. She had no idea what it was. She was a waitress, not a lawyer. This was beyond her. The fragile confidence she had built over the last hour threatened to shatter. "Sir," she said to Sterling, her voice wavering for the first time, "he is referring to a specific clause in the contract, paragraph 17, the legacy clause. He says your team wants it removed, and it is the main reason the deal has stalled." Sterling's face darkened. The legacy clause. It's a page of meaningless, poetic nonsense. It talks about honoring the spirit of the founders and community stewardship. It has no legal teeth. It's unenforceable fluff. Our lawyers quite rightly want it gone. It creates potential liabilities based on sentiment. Sarah looked back at Richter, then at Sterling. She was caught in the middle of the single most important disagreement of the entire merger, and she was completely out of her depth. The pressure in the room suddenly refocused, narrowing to a single point right where Sarah sat. The brief camaraderie forged through technical discussion evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of a legal impasse. "Tell her, Richa," Sterling said, his voice clipped and impatient, "that our legal team is second to none. If they say the clause is a liability, it's a liability. We can issue a press release about honoring his company's history. We can put up a plaque, but we will not put vague emotional language into a multi-billion-dollar contract." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. She had to choose her words carefully. A direct translation of Sterling's dismissive tone would send them right back to square one. She turned to Rita. "Hera," she began in German, "Mr. Sterling acknowledges the significance of your company's history. However, his legal advisors are concerned that the current wording of the legacy clause, being rooted in principle rather than precise legal definitions, could create unforeseen complications in the future. They prefer to honor the spirit of the clause through public commitments rather than contractual obligation." She had softened the edges, but the core message was the same. The clause was a problem. Rita listened, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, which he slid across the table to Sarah. It was a copy of paragraph 17 written in German. "Read it," he commanded, not with the eyes of a lawyer, but with the eyes of a scholar. Then you will understand. Sarah picked up the paper. Her hands trembled slightly. The text was not dense legal jargon. It was, as Sterling had said, almost poetic. It spoke of the company's duty not just to its shareholders, but to its employees and the town where it was founded. It stipulated that for a period of 25 years, the company would not lay off more than 5% of its local workforce in any given year without first investing in retraining programs. It mandated that a percentage of profits be reinvested into community apprenticeships, carrying on the tradition of the German Mittelstand model, where businesses see themselves as integral parts of the social fabric. It wasn't fluff. It was a covenant. It was the soul of his company codified on paper. It was everything her academic research had taught her about the German industrial psyche. They didn't just build machines. They built communities. They didn't think in fiscal quarters. They thought in generations. Sterling's team saw a liability. Richter saw a promise to his grandfather. Suddenly, Sarah noticed something else. At the bottom of the page was a small annotation, a handwritten note in English initialed DC. It read, "Client insists on this high clause. Recommend removal. Sentimental, no quantifiable value. DC, David Chen." Her eyes flickered towards him. He was watching her, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. He had been the one interfacing with the German legal team. He had been the one to frame this clause for Sterling's lawyers. And he had used the German word Heimat, a deeply resonant term meaning her homeland or a place of deep belonging, and reduced it to sentimental. He hadn't just failed to translate the words. He had actively stripped them of their profound cultural and emotional significance. Whether through ignorance or a deliberate attempt to simplify the issue for his superiors, the result was the same catastrophic misrepresentation. He had positioned the heart of the deal as a cancerous tumor to be excised. This was the real problem. It wasn't just a misunderstanding in the dining room. The entire foundation of the negotiation had been built on a flawed, shallow interpretation of the other side's values. "I understand," Sarah said softly, looking up from the paper directly at RTOR. Her voice was filled with a new quiet authority. She turned to Sterling. "Sir, with all due respect to your legal team, they have been given a profoundly inaccurate understanding of what this clause represents. The man who advised them." She glanced pointedly at David Chen, who flinched as if struck, labeled this clause as sentimental. "That is a catastrophic misinterpretation." "What are you talking about?" Sterling demanded, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't a legacy clause." "Sir," Sarah explained, her voice gaining passion, "in German, the concept it's built around is Heimat. It doesn't have a perfect English equivalent. It means more than home. It's about roots identity, a sense of belonging that is intertwined with community. This paragraph isn't about feelings. It's a structural guarantee. It's the German equivalent of a constitutional promise to his people and his town that this merger won't strip the company of its soul. It's a promise that Sterling Dynamics won't just buy the factory, but that it will inherit the responsibility that comes with it." She slid the paper across the table to Sterling. "He's not asking for a plaque, Mr. Sterling. He's asking you to be a custodian of a 100-year-old trust. He is testing you. He needs to know if you are a partner who will uphold that trust or an acquirer who will strip his company for parts and discard the community. It was built to support." The room was silent. Sarah had just performed open-heart surgery on the deal, laying bare the blockage that had been slowly killing it for weeks. She had recontextualized the entire conflict, moving it from a legal squabble to a profound question of character and intent. Robert Sterling stared at the paper, then at Sarah, then at the suddenly nervous-looking David Chen. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind. The weeks of frustration, the reports from David about the stubborn and emotional Germans, the inexplicable friction, it all suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. He had been fighting the wrong war on the wrong battlefield because his own scout had given him a faulty map. Amelia Hayes looked at David Chen with eyes of ice. His career at Sterling Dynamics was over. She knew it, he knew it, and Sterling was just beginning to realize it. Finally, Sterling looked at Klaus Richter. The anger and frustration were gone, replaced by a dawning, grudging respect. He had been tested, and he had been failing. "Ask him," Sterling said to Sarah, his voice low and serious. if he would give me the honor of explaining how I intend to be that custodian? Sarah turned back to Klaus Richa, her role shifting once more. She was no longer just an interpreter of words, but a facilitator of understanding the chief architect of a bridge being built across a cultural canyon. Her Richa, she relayed her German formal, yet imbued with the gravity of the moment. Mr. Sterling wishes to express his profound regret. He confesses that he has been viewing this document through the wrong lens. He asks for the honor of explaining to you not his legal position, but his personal commitment to becoming a custodian of the trust your family has built. The choice of the word era honor was crucial. It resonated with RTOR's traditional values. For the first time all evening, the German CEO leaned back in his chair, a sign that he was prepared to listen, truly listen. And so began the most important negotiation of Robert Sterling's life. It was a negotiation not of numbers or terms, but of principles. Guided by Sarah's questions, prompted by her nuanced understanding of what Richter needed to hear, Sterling began to speak. He didn't talk about maximizing profits. He talked about his own grandfather, a man who had started a small machine shop in his garage in Detroit. He spoke of the pride of creating something tangible, of providing jobs, of being a pillar in a community. He admitted that in the rush to grow his global corporation, he had sometimes lost sight of those founding principles. Sarah translated it all. She captured the hint of vulnerability in Sterling's voice, the genuine regret, and the newfound respect. She conveyed it to Richter not as a calculated business tactic, but as a sincere confession from one company founder's grandson to another. "Tell him," Sterling said, leaning forward, his hands flat on the table, "that I see now. Paragraph 17 is not a liability. It is a feature, not a bug. It's a quality control mechanism for the company's soul, and I will not remove it. I will sign it, and I will give him my personal guarantee as a man that I will uphold it." When Sarah translated this, a stillness fell upon the German delegation. Richter looked at Sterling, studying his face intently, searching for any sign of insincerity. He found none. The American CEO, who hours before had been a caricature of impatience and arrogance, now looked like a statesman. Order then asked a series of sharp, probing questions. What did Sterling know of the German apprenticeship model? How would he integrate it? How would he ensure the plant manager in his German facility had the autonomy to make decisions that benefited the local community, even if they didn't show immediate returns on a quarterly report? These were questions Sterling's team had never even considered. But with Sarah there to explain the context behind them, Sterling rose to the challenge. He didn't offer canned corporate answers. He offered creative, collaborative solutions. He suggested forming a joint heritage committee, co-chaired by Richter himself, to oversee the implementation of the legacy clause. He proposed funding a new STEM education program at the local German high school to create a pipeline for future apprentices. He wasn't just agreeing to the clause, he was embracing it, building upon it. The atmosphere in the room was transformed. The chill had dissipated, replaced by a palpable warmth of mutual respect and excitement. The two associates of Hera, who had been so stoic before, were now smiling, murmuring to each other in appreciative tones. Finally, after nearly 2 more hours of constructive dialogue, Klaus Richa stood up. Robert Sterling and his team immediately rose as well. Richter walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Sarah. He looked down at her, his blue eyes no longer icy, but filled with a deep, sincere gratitude. "Miss Jenkins," he said in German, his voice resonating with emotion. "In my 70 years, I have worked with ambassadors, ministers, and the most expensive consultants in the world. I can say without hesitation that you are the most effective communicator I have ever met. You did not just translate our words tonight. You translated our intentions, our souls." He then switched to his careful English for everyone to hear. "You have saved this great enterprise." He turned to Sterling and extended his hand. "Mr. Sterling, we have a deal. Send me the contract tomorrow. Do not change a single word of paragraph 17. Sterling grasped his hand firmly, a wide, genuine smile breaking across his face. "You have my word, Klaus." The handshake was firm, the relief in the room so thick it was almost a physical presence. The deal was done. As the two CEOs spoke, sharing a quiet laugh, Amelia Hayes approached Sarah, who was still seated looking slightly dazed by the whirlwind of events. That was the most extraordinary thing I have ever witnessed in my career, Amelia said, her voice low and full of awe. Before Sarah could respond, Sterling turned his attention to his disgraced junior executive. His voice, now devoid of heat, was chillingly cold. David, he said, not even looking at him, Amelia will be waiting for you in her office at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring your resignation letter. David Chen stared at Sterling, his face a mess of panic and shame. He opened his mouth to protest, to make an excuse, but a single withering look from Sterling silenced him. He grabbed his briefcase and practically fled the room without another word. The path of destruction caused by his ignorance and ambition was finally cleared, and in its place stood Sarah, the quiet waitress who had single-handedly salvaged a multi-billion-dollar legacy. Robert Sterling now turned to her, his expression a complex mixture of gratitude, embarrassment, and sheer astonishment. Miss Jenkins, he began, I owe you an apology and a debt I'm not sure I can ever repay. The aftermath of the handshake was surreal. The Germans, now warm and talkative, were sharing a celebratory glass of vintage cognac with Sterling and Amelia Hayes. The tension of the evening had vanished so completely it felt like a distant dream. In the center of it all, Sarah sat an island of quiet disbelief. She had come into this room to clear plates, and she was leaving it having reshaped the future of two global corporations. Sterling, after concluding his conversation with RT, walked over to her. He pulled up a chair and sat down. Not as a CEO addressing a waitress, but as a man acknowledging a peer. I was wrong, he said, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. I was rude. I was dismissive. And I was about to fire the most valuable person in the room. I am truly sorry. It's all right, Mr. Sterling, Sarah murmured, still overwhelmed. You were under a lot of pressure. That's an excuse, not a reason, he countered. What you did tonight, it wasn't just translation. You have a gift, Miss Jenkins. A profound understanding of people that's rarer than any balance sheet or patent. He paused, studying her. I looked you up, he admitted. Or rather, I had Amelia do it while I was talking to Klaus. University of Chicago, PhD candidate, Germanic studies, full scholarship. You were at the top of your class. He shook his head in wonder. What happened? The question was direct, but his tone was gentle, genuinely curious. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt no shame in telling her story. She spoke of the accident of her parents, of her sister Molly, and of the dissertation on German industrial philosophy left to gather dust on her laptop. Sterling listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. You gave up your future for your family, he stated simply. It wasn't a question. That's honor. That's legacy. The very thing I was too blind to see in Arthur's contract. You've been living it every single day. He stood up. This isn't a job offer, Miss Jenkins, because what you're doing now is not your job. This is a course correction. I am creating a new position at Sterling Dynamics, effective immediately, Vice President of International Strategy and Cultural Relations. It will report directly to me. I need someone to ensure that we never ever walk into a room this blind again. I need a custodian for our company's soul. The salary will be enough to pay for your sister's college education 100 times over, and we will fund the completion of your PhD if you still want it. Sarah stared at him speechless. Vice President, the words didn't compute. It was a fairy tale, a fantasy. Waitresses didn't become VPs overnight, but the look on Sterling's face was deadly serious. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Say yes, Amelia Hayes said, joining them with a warm smile. Believe me, Sarah, we need you more than you need us. As the German delegation prepared to leave, Harriet approached her one last time. He handed her a simple, elegant business card. If this man ever fails to appreciate you, Rita said in German, a twinkle in his eye, you call me, there will always be a place for you at Rita Precision's Technic, the very highest place. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she accepted the card. They were not tears of sadness or relief, but of a profound, overwhelming sense of restoration. The part of her she thought was dead and buried to the scholar, the intellectual, the strategist, was alive and well. It had been there all along, waiting for a chance to speak. An hour later, Sarah walked out of the Gilded Compass for the last time. The cold Chicago wind hit her face, but she didn't feel it. She wasn't an invisible waitress anymore. She was Sarah Jenkins, the woman who understood the poetry of business, the one who could hear the silent language of the soul. Her past was not a tragedy that had derailed her. It was the education that had prepared her. And her future was no longer a question of surviving until the next paycheck, but of striding into a boardroom and ensuring that no one's voice, no matter the language, would ever be lost in translation again. Sarah's story is a powerful reminder that the most extraordinary skills can be found in the most unexpected places. It shows us that true value isn't always listed on a resume or reflected in a job title. Sometimes it's the quiet observer, the person who has faced hardship and cultivated a deep, unseen knowledge who holds the key. Her journey wasn't just about knowing another language. It was about understanding people on a fundamental level, their history, their values, their pride. It proves that empathy and cultural intelligence are not soft skills. They are superpowers in our interconnected world. Her life was changed in one night, not by luck, but because she had the courage to use a voice she thought the world had forced her to silence. If this story inspired you or made you think, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And for more true stories about hidden heroes and incredible life-changing moments, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that their unique knowledge is valuable. Thank you for watching.